The recent return of the wiseman Paul Heyman on last week's episode of SmackDown, today on the J Area podcast, we discuss the long, illustrious career of Paul Heyman and why it's so important to have a significant manager by your side in professional wrestling. What is going on, pro wrestling fans? My name is Ramos Jr. Welcome back to another episode of the J Area Wrestling Podcast. And like I mentioned in the intro, Paul Heyman makes his huge, long-awaited return to the WWE following the vicious attack by Solo Sikoa and his bloodline that emanated from Madison Square Garden just a few months ago. Paul Heyman certainly is one of those characters in professional wrestling where I think at times he may go under the radar when it comes to his facial expressions or just his presence within that of a professional wrestling storyline. But once you see him away from the ring, once away from the camera, his presence really is missed. Paul Heyman, I think, is going to go down as one of, if he's not already considered to be one of the most important and significant non-wrestling characters in the business. He has a long career associated with some of the greatest wrestlers of all time, some of the greatest stories of all time. So I thought it was very important to dedicate this episode of the J Area podcast to Paul Heyman, as well as the level of significance to that of pro wrestling managers. I start with Paul Heyman because obviously he just returned. And I was already debating about doing an episode on Paul Heyman because we knew he was going to return at some point for the lead up to Survivor Series. But being that he did turn up on SmackDown this last week, let's go ahead and let's focus in on Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman, who of course is a native of New York City, known to be a hustler ever since he was a young kid. I mean, he entered the business at a very young age because at 11 years old, he was already running mailing orders where he was selling photographs of celebrities as well as memorabilia. He somehow managed to convince people outside of arenas to allow him access due to his photographs and his experience as a photojournalist. That's how he was able to gain entry into places like Madison Square Garden for the WWF. And since then, Paul Heyman really has made an impact in professional wrestling. You go back to the times in the WCW with the Dangerous Alliance, obviously his time in ECW, and his long career in WWE. There is a bit of his fingerprints on nearly every corner on the book that is professional wrestling. I think he goes down certainly as one of the greatest managers of all time, and I also think that without him, we may not have had the level of success that pro wrestling is today because of his contributions to not only the business, but specifically ECW. And I think that's where I'm going to start here, talking about ECW, because ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, was such a monumental and influential organization that it's still felt to this day. I mean, we just saw a couple weeks ago an entire episode of NXT dedicated to ECW airing from the ECW arena. Obviously, it was known as Eastern Championship Wrestling, but by the time that Paul Heyman got there and got his hands on the booking and the company itself, it would transition to Extreme Championship Wrestling. And the idea was, for Paul Heyman and company, that it would be an alternative to the alternative. You see, mainstream audiences of professional wrestling, they had WWF, they had WCW, and at this time there wasn't a lot of prominent indie promotions or prominent third, tertiary type of level companies. But this was an opportunity for Paul Heyman to stick out. One thing that WWE and WCW had in its pocket was money. They had a great financial stability in their cases. They had tremendous TV rights, TV production, backings by millionaires and billionaires and stockholders alike. ECW was that renegade promotion that really stood the test of time because of its ability to connect with fans on a broader sense. Where WWE and WCW at that time, of course, was a little bit PC friendly and they followed the rules and norms that was sports entertainment. ECW wasn't afraid to color outside of the lines. ECW was one of the first promotions to introduce realism and real storylines on its show. There was a lot of action, there was a lot of drama. Some people thought the blood might have been grotesque, but it was certainly something that attracted young audience members as well as diehard fans to keep coming back. You saw big promotions in ECW that led to the stars that we know today. Guys like Rob Van Dam, the Dudley Boys, Sabu, Tommy Dreamer, Raven, so many other individuals that come to mind. And it's all in large part due to their contributions, but you have to give a tip of the hat to Paul Heyman, who was the leader of this self-proclaimed revolution. Another thing that ECW stood out to was its use of licensed music. One of the obvious references would be Sandman, who entered to Metallica's Enter the Sandman, really blending the two of modern music with professional wrestling, specifically when it came to the rock scene. A lot of people associate that genre of music with pro wrestling. It reminds us of the golden years of the Attitude Era in the 90s and the early 2000s. ECW had a large part in introducing the two audiences to one another. ECW, as I talked about, was a renegade promotion because it wasn't afraid to tackle barriers and it wasn't afraid to step outside of the norm. And I think that's one thing that WWE and WCW took note of. WCW, who was the main competitor to the WWF at that time, they wanted to do something different. They wanted to be an alternative to the WWE. So what did they do? They went realism. They wanted real storylines that blended reality and fiction. The New World Order, the NWO, was one of those first instances where fans were questioning whether or not this was a shoot or was it a work. And in large part, you can look at ECW for doing things like that, for being able to blend reality and fiction. It was not only their realism in their storylines, but the action itself, where we saw more hardcore wrestling that would influence decisions like WWE going for the Attitude Era. ECW was recognized for its, car crash TV, meaning that it was all go and little stops. There was always something going on. It was always transitioning to another story, whether it was shock value, whether it was technical prowess, or whether it was just a means of connecting with the audience on different levels. The Attitude Era was significant in doing that. When you had guys like Stone Cold Steve Austin flipping off the boss, D-Generation X with their vulgar speech, it was in large part due to what ECW had done. And ECW and Paul Heyman managed to create a partnership with the WWE. I mean, you look at the 97 year where they were going to have their first pay-per-view barely legal. It introduced audiences to ECW, large audiences. Obviously, the Philadelphia and New York scene were familiar with the Extreme Championship Wrestling promotion, but on a large scheme, maybe not a lot of people knew them. So it was a great opportunity for exposure for ECW. Not only was it a great partnership for ECW, but for WWE as well, because it shown that they were willing to grow and help out another promotion. Rather, maybe not help out, but acknowledge that times were changing, and they were willing to work with that. The ultimate enemy was the WCW, but ECW was really that third tier promotion like I talked about, because they had really introduced so many, talent. Guys like Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, Psychosis. These were guys that had gotten their start in ECW. Other guys who were able to rehabilitate their careers. Look at a guy like Stone Cold Steve Austin, who had left WCW. Rather, he was fired by WCW and was stunning Steve Austin, one half of the Hollywood Blondes. And in time, between his WCW exit and his arrival in the WWF, he spent a short time in the ECW arena. And this is where he really got to hone in on who Stone Cold Steve Austin would become. This is where he regained that confidence and this new presentation of what Stunning Steve turned into Stone Cold Steve Austin. ECW was a great market not only for the diehard fans, but for fans like you and I who just wanted something different. We saw in WWF around this time, it was like The Undertaker versus Psycho Sid, two behemoths, two giants competing for the top prize in that promotion. At that same time, WCW had the New World Order, an ever-growing organization built to destroy World Championship Wrestling, where a babyface like Sting was tasked with bringing them down. But then if you wanted something different, something a little bit more grunge, if you will, you go to ECW, and they had these hardcore matches, these lucha libre style matches, technical matches that involved Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero. You also had the iconic rivalry between Raven and Tommy Dreamer that really dove into the psychology and the backstories, the origins of these characters as they were friends, growing up as children, and then their feud over Beulah McGillicuddy until becoming adults in the ECW arena. It was long-term storytelling. It became an access for us to have a new world of wrestling. And Paul Heyman was really the focal point. Now, I talk about all these great things about ECW, and I do think it's important to recognize that it was not always sunshine and rainbows down in the land of extreme, because Paul Heyman and ECW, as I mentioned, lacked the one thing that his competition had, and that was financial backings. These guys were struggling to stay afloat when it came to money. They were losing money, they were losing viewerships, and because of this extreme nature of their product, they would lose sponsors, they would lose deals, because it wasn't something that mainstream really wanted to produce. You can look at guys like New Jack and the whole mass transit incident. You can look at all the injuries and the controversies that came out of ECW. A lot of good, but a fair share of bad as well. This is what led to them closing up shop in 2000 and ultimately getting bought out due to bankruptcy in 2001, where WWF would purchase them. And this is when ECW's Paul Heyman made his, tenure with the WWE into something great. But of course, I'll get to that in a moment, because I want to jump back a little bit back in time. We talked about ECW because I think Paul Heyman is widely considered to be the father of ECW. He's widely considered to be the face of that promotion, even though there's a bunch of guys who come out of that promotion as one of the greatest of all time, let alone some of the legends that he helped along the way. I think it's important to recognize that Paul Heyman in WCW for a time being was also a manager of the Dangerous Alliance. He had a huge part in the original set of War Games matchup, which I think is very ironic given that he's already participated as a manager, of course, in a couple War Games matches already here in the WWE. But looking at his time here in ECW and in WCW, listen to the names that he was already associated with. Prior to entering the WWE, Paul Heyman had enlisted his own services to individuals like Arn Anderson, Larry Zbyszko, the living legend. We also had Rick Rude, Stunning Steve Austin, a young Undertaker going by the name of Mark Calloway. In ECW, he helped the likes of the Dudley Boys, Sabu, Taz, Shane Douglas, Rob Van Dam, just to name a few names. A lot of these guys are Hall of Fame worthy talents if they're not already in the Hall of Fame, and world champions all across the board. Individuals who have become influential, and you can't tell the story of professional wrestling without some of these names. Paul Heyman always had an eye for talent, but I also think it's important to recognize that he is a hustler at the end of the day. That's why you look at his Twitter page, or his X page, whatever you want to call it. It's at Heyman Hustle, because he's been a hustler since day one. Paul Heyman knows what it means to have nothing and make it into something. And I think that's one of the more important lessons to take from the Paul Heyman story, is that starting as a photojournalist, or whether it was the mail-in business regarding celebrity photographs, he was always doing something to get the money, to get the dollar. And I think Paul Heyman is one of the more resilient individuals in the business. For someone that is not a pro wrestler, to have spent so much time around the business, to have been associated with some of the biggest names in the business, it's no wonder why Raven, a former ECW champion, an ECW legend, has said about Paul Heyman, quote, "He's the most creative genius in the business, and it's the most creative genius the business has ever seen." High praise for Paul Heyman. But like I said, it wasn't always like that. Some individuals had held grudges against Paul Heyman, because towards the end of ECW, there were times where checks would bounce and the money wasn't coming in. And Paul Heyman, unbeknownst to a lot of guys in ECW, was working with Vince McMahon in the WWE, and he was help financing ECW. Because if anything, ECW became almost like this feeder to the WWE, where they could use some of their talent, where they could use some of their ideas, and in a way, hoping to grow ECW, but really to benefit the WWE. That's why when he had made the jump to WWE so soon after the announcement of ECW going bankrupt, a lot of guys like Tommy Dreamer held a grudge towards Paul Heyman. In fact, there's a theory that apparently has been proven correct, that Tommy Dreamer at one point was so frustrated with the financial issues in ECW that during WrestleMania 17, where Paul Heyman was the commentator alongside Jim Ross, that Tommy Dreamer had a plan on live pay-per-view to attack Paul Heyman and basically off him in front of everybody. Now, thankfully, that didn't happen, because that in itself would have put a huge damper on what is considered to be the best pay-per-view of all time. But also, when you put it in the sense of putting someone's life on the line, it's a very dramatic and a very serious situation that thankfully did not come to fruition. But since then, I talk about WrestleMania 17 because that was the first pay-per-view that Paul Heyman was a commentator for. Since then, he has managed to create practically two different careers: his pre-WWE tenure and his current post-debut in the WWE tenure. Paul Heyman has managed to become a fixture of WWE TV, whether it was as an authority figure, whether it was as a heel, whether it was as a wise man, an advocate. He was always on TV, and when he had something to say, we listened. I listed some of the names that he was associated with outside of the WWE, but then you look at the people he was associated with in WWE: world champions, Hall of Famers, all-time legends, guys like Kurt Angle, guys like Brock Lesnar, Roman Reigns, CM Punk. I talk about often here on the J area, on the channel, that Paul Heyman has three of the longest reigning world title reigns in the modern era. In 2013, CM Punk's 434-day title reign had ended. It was the longest reigning world championship in WWE history since the Hulk Hogan years. Fast forward a few years later, Brock Lesnar would win the Universal Champion, beating CM Punk's record, rather. Paul Heyman outdoing himself again. And it wouldn't be until earlier this year that Roman Reigns' Universal title reign that lasted 1,316 days became, I believe, top 3, top 4 maybe, of the longest reigning world title reigns of all time. Paul Heyman is the common denominator when it comes to each of these title reigns. And I know a lot of this is talking about him in front of the camera, but behind the scenes, Paul Heyman has also had a great presence in terms of creative. One of his greatest contributions to WWE since the falling of ECW, I still think, is the SmackDown 6 and the overall presentation of SmackDown during the year 2002. Maybe a little bit 2003 as well, but certainly in those early, that time of SmackDown when it was brand splitted from Raw. You had the SmackDown 6. Many individuals who were already associated with ECW: Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and Chris Benoit. Of course, it also included Kurt Angle, Chavo Guerrero, and Edge. The combination of those talents, whether it was a tag team match, a singles match, or triple threat match, it didn't matter. Any combination of those 6 individuals, and you were guaranteed a fantastic performance and a match that would basically be a guaranteed match of the night contender. That's what he was able to do, because whereas Raw at the time was presented as the story show, where you had guys like Triple H and the Reign of Terror, when you had SmackDown, on the other hand, Paul Heyman focused more on the wrestling. He recognized that, okay, what can we do to combat Raw? Because at this time, WCW and ECW were already out of business. So the plan for the WWE was to create its own competition within itself. Raw and SmackDown, although we're not going head to head, it was important to see that they were continuing to grow those products, those brands. So whereas Raw was very heavily story-centered on its television program, Paul Heyman, again, being the contrarian, thinking outside the box and doing the alternative, said, okay, they're going to focus on stories. Let's focus on in-ring. And that's where he was able to excel. There was a time being there where SmackDown was perceived as the best show on WWE TV. And again, I think you got to give certain props to Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman and his time as the voice, as the mouthpiece for Brock Lesnar was around this time as well. Of course, Brock Lesnar debuted after WrestleMania 18. And while Paul Heyman, behind the scenes, was helping run SmackDown, he was also on screen being the advocate for Brock Lesnar. Of course, there was a time being where it was also Big Show and Kurt Angle. But he always was able to balance it between performer and between creative genius. And Paul Heyman needs that props. That's why he won the Hall of Fame this year. Because he, along with a lot of members of the Hall of Fame, are intricate parts of the history of the business that you and I have become such fans of. And I've learned to become a fan of Paul Heyman through his dedication, through his love for the game. And there was a time from the years 2006 to 2012 where he stepped away. This was following that incarnation of ECW that we don't really talk about a lot, or we rather not talk about. Obviously, I'm referring to WWECW, where Vince McMahon thought it would be a great idea to reintroduce ECW and kind of slap his own take on it, even though it was not at all what it should have been. In fact, I talked about it on a previous post-show reaction for SmackDown, where ECW, that WWE version, really could have stood on its own. If they wanted to present it the way it was, all they had to do was not include the name ECW, because you're already associating a brand. You're establishing, rather, you're utilizing an established brand onto something that was not in sync with it. Paul Heyman didn't like the direction, so he left in December of 2006. And there were 6 years where we did not see any inclusion of Paul Heyman. Nothing on TV, nothing behind the scenes. And it wouldn't be until after WrestleMania 28, again, when Brock Lesnar made his return. And from 2012 to current day WWE, I think the argument could be made that this is the best run on TV that Paul Heyman has ever had. And think about that. 30 years into the business, whether it's in front of the camera or behind the camera. And I think this is the best that we've seen from Paul Heyman. This would include his run with Lesnar, CM Punk, and Roman Reigns. Every time I see Paul Heyman on the screen, I'm mesmerized by his performance. It's the subtleties of Paul Heyman. It's in the eyes. It's in the facial expressions. It's in the tone of his voice, his body language. He's managed to master what it means to be that secondary character. And that by no means is to discredit him as a force in terms of performances. But it's because when the eyes and the attention should be on the champion, on a Roman, on a Punk, on Brock, every time you glance over at Paul Heyman, he helps enhance that story. He helps establish the mood. There were times there with Roman Reigns who was delivering a powerful promo talking about how this is my camera, this is my table, this is my WWE, I own everything. And you see Paul Heyman behind him with this brash and just this arrogance to him, as if to re-acknowledge that yes, Roman Reigns is telling the truth, and it's just the posture, the way he would look at the camera with those fierce eyes, almost as a way to punctuate every word that Roman Reigns is saying. Or whether it's when CM Punk was on his run of a cocky heel who demanded the respect of everyone around him as the WWE champion, that Paul Heyman would so eloquently raise the WWE title above his hand and to show off to every member of the audience member that everything he's saying, everything he is telling you, you know is the truth. Why? Because he can back it up, because he's holding this WWE title. And at times when guys like Solo Sikoa are becoming so fierce and becoming so intimidating to where Paul Heyman is in fear, practically in tears, it's little things like that that really put over the talent that is involved. And Paul Heyman has managed to master that. The show's not about him. The show has never been about Paul Heyman. But he'll be damned if he wasn't going to do his best to help elevate the others around him. Paul Heyman not only is one of the greatest wisemen, one of the greatest advocates, managers, he's probably one of the best hype men. Because you put him next to anybody, and they're going to get over. They're going to be presented as a clear-cut talent. Now, I will say some of those have not been to fruition. Guys like Curtis Axel and Ryback immediately come to mind, but hey, they tried. And that's all it is. You can't make every shot. Michael Jordan missed a couple of game winners here and there, but it's about those makes. And I'm telling you, when it comes to those big three of Brock, Punk, and Roman Reigns, those are three huge slam dunks of an advocate managerial relationship with a professional wrestler. And Paul Heyman still going strong and now heading into War Games, where his return as a manager has been long awaited. He's going to have the help of Roman Reigns and the original Bloodline, and now CM Punk. And for me, that's huge because I was a teen. I was growing up watching CM Punk and Paul Heyman. That's when I began learning about their friendship and their protege and mentor like relationship. And it's when I became fixated on the life and career of Paul Heyman because his mind for the business is second to none. He knows how to deliver a promo. He knows how to deliver body language. And obviously, in the case of ECW and SmackDown, he knows how to deliver a show. And it shows because he had this relationship with Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes, who has become one of the more significant figures in professional wrestling because of his mind, because of his contributions to the business. You can see it in Paul Heyman. And if you go back to last year, WrestleMania 39, the build up to that, it was alluded to by Paul Heyman and the Cody Rhodes promos that they had with one another. Paul Heyman, I think, will have a similar impact. Dusty Rhodes was more so of a fanfare because he was on TV. He was a professional wrestler, world champion. But for a lot of the guys in the back, he was also that voice of reason. He was that he had the presence of mind to provide advice that would withstand the tests of time. And I think that version of Dusty Rhodes, the behind the cameras, who would give you the advice that not that you wanted to hear, but that you needed. I think it's going to end up being Paul Heyman's legacy, being able to forge a relationship with a lot of his peers, whether they are old grizzled veterans or whether they are young up and coming. Paul Heyman has those qualities. And that brings me obviously to this next segment of the episode of the podcast, and that's just the importance of a manager. Some of the best managers, if we were to just list some off here, off the top of my head, obviously, of course, Paul Heyman, Bobby Heenan, Miss Elizabeth, Lou Albano, just to name a few. The one thing all these individuals had in common is that they had the level of discipline to not take away from their star. Now, when it was time for them to speak, a la Bobby Heenan and Paul Heyman, you listen to them. You listen to what they had to say, but the clear-cut message above everything else was that, hey, I am who I am. I am serving as the manager for this individual because they are great. They are so and so. It was always a means of reestablishing who I am, why I'm here. Oh yeah, it's because this guy's going to become the next World Heavyweight Champion. He's going to defeat the top babyface and rule over the whole promotion for years to come. And that's something that is a lost art, certainly in the WWE. There was a time being, during the PG era, the reality era, the late 2000s to early 2010s, and you can argue still to this day, that the position of the manager has been lost. And I think that's such a shame. Just like the tag team division, I think it's an art form that really needs to be highlighted more so. Because I like the names I listed of a Bobby Heenan, Paul Heyman, Miss Elizabeth, they all managed to have their own presence. You knew of them, you knew what they were about, but at the same time, you had them linked with their talent. You knew Miss Elizabeth was with the Macho Man, Randy Savage. You knew Bobby Heenan was with guys like Ric Flair, Mr. Perfect, Andre the Giant. Again, Bobby Heenan is another one of those names, like a Paul Heyman, who has been associated with so much talent. I go back to, you can't tell the story of professional wrestling without this individual. That's the level of significance that they were able to carve out. And the managerial position is something that I've always looked forward to. Because there's sometimes in wrestling where maybe the wrestler doesn't want to cut a promo. Maybe he doesn't have to. Or maybe in the off chance, he's not a good promo. But you have a manager like that to put you over, and now all you got to do is handle your business. That is the dream for an aspiring world champion in the sense of pro wrestling. One thing that comes to mind, obviously, is this past weekend, we had AEW Full Gear. And solid pay-per-view all around. If you guys want my take and my opinions on what had happened at Full Gear, be sure to check out the post-show reaction to AEW Full Gear, now available on the channel. Check it out, see what you guys think. Go ahead and comment down below on your thoughts on the outcomes and what you made of that ending to the pay-per-view. But following the Full Gear pay-per-view, of course, AEW has their post-show media scrum where they have members of the media interview and ask questions for the talent. And one that really stuck out for me was the Hurt Syndicate. Bobby Lashley, Shelton Benjamin, and of course, accompanied by MVP, who represents the Hurt Syndicate. And I thought MVP is he is the epitome of what that old school manager should be. WWE has Paul Heyman, who I think second to none is the greatest manager of all time. But AEW with MVP, now that's a knockout of the park. The way he interacted with the media members, answering the questions very quick, very concise, almost with a brash of arrogance, but also a sense of confidence. They would ask him a question on like, hey, so you came in, talking to Bobby Lashley, you came in set on dominating All Elite Wrestling. Now that you've won this matchup against Swerve Strickland, a former world champion, what is the plan moving forward? And in no hesitation, MVP says, to continue dominating. Next question. Bobby Lashley would be asked a question, he would attempt to answer it, and MVP would shut it down and say, that's a dumb question, don't even answer that, Bobby. He commanded the room. The attention, yes, I talked about how managers shouldn't have the attention on them. But in that sense, MVP set the tone of this is who we are. We don't mean to play around. We're all business, and we're here to hurt people. And he set the tone for what they are supposed to do. I would venture to say the big storyline in All Elite Wrestling right now is the Death Riders and Jon Moxley as the AEW World Champion trying to kick everyone back into shape, saying that we need to get serious, we need to get grittier, like how we were years ago. But I'm kind of more invested in the Hurt Syndicate. Bobby Lashley is a beast. Shelton Benjamin is a freak of nature when it comes to athleticism. And MVP is an all-world talent on the microphone. And that post-media scrum, it sealed the deal for me. MVP, he gets it. He knows what it means to be that mouthpiece. Because we all know that Bobby Lashley and Shelton Benjamin, they're not well known for their abilities on the microphone. Now, when it comes to in the ring, second to none. But MVP, what he has is that gift of gab. He can talk. He can speak. Another guy like Heyman, when he speaks, you listen. And I watched that post-media scrum, and I just smiled because I'm like, he gets it. MVP, he understands the importance of that position to be the mouthpiece for his client, for the professional wrestler. And I'm hoping that as we continue to see the business grow into one of the most profitable times in recent memory, maybe of all time. Again, this current iteration of the product, I think you can put up against the Attitude Era, the 90s, during the Monday Night Wars, potentially the Rock and Wrestling era in the 80s. I know that one's a touchy subject because it's what established WrestleMania and put them on the map. But to see the heights that it's grown nowadays, to where the WWE has managed to deal with Netflix, entering millions and millions of more homes. And now AEW with Max, we're streaming live content on streaming services like that, reaching a grander audience and presenting pro wrestling on such a global scale. I think it'd be so cool if we could start kind of going backwards in a good way, simplifying it. We know that the managerial position works because it did for so many years. That's why, as I mentioned all those names, they are associated with some of the greatest acts in pro wrestling, and they are all Hall of Famers, if not already Hall of Famers. The managerial position is underrated, and it's something I want to see more of. And I want to hear from you guys. Who were some of your favorite managers in professional wrestling? Who were some that really stuck out to you growing up as a pro wrestling fan, or that still are to this day? Please make sure to comment down below all your questions and comments in regards to the topics that we discussed here on the podcast, as well as other topics that include WWE or AEW. Of course, make sure to like the video, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with all the pro wrestling content that is produced here on the channel. And of course, my name is Jose Ramos Jr., and I'll be sure to check you guys all out here on the J Area Wrestling YouTube channel. Until then, we'll see you then.